Well, good morning, everyone. And we've really had an amazing morning. I want to thank David and Brian for such a touching, reflective synopsis of what risk is and the impact of decision-making in healthcare. There were a lot of questions from the audience, and I wanted to start off with a definition that I had read recently as I was researching what you guys have been working on, and it's on risk communication. And this is what I saw. It said, risk communication is defined as actions, words, and other interactions that incorporate and respect the perceptions of the information that is given to recipients, and is intended to help people make more informed decisions about threats to their health and safety. So I read that, and I thought implicitly in the definition of risk communication is this idea that people will make informed decisions with information. But it also assumes, I think, that these decisions that are going to be made are logical ones. And so I was wondering, is the ultimate goal of providing information to get people to make the right decision, the best decision, or just to feel more informed?
Boy, you don't start with the small questions, do you?
Yes.
I like his answer.
Next question.
Now, in one sense, to answer that question, you have to go back to the question of what does it mean to define the right decision? What does it mean to define a good decision? Sometimes we will never know whether or not we made the decision that led to the best outcome. We can only know that we used a process that considered the information, that incorporated it into the way we're thinking about the problem. I will never know if I would have lived a long time had I not done the transplant. That is not part of my knowledge set. But I can be confident in the way that I went through that process to help me make a decision that I feel I will not regret. Now, had it turned out poorly, would I still be saying that? I don't know. It would be a lot harder. But that's part of the measure of what a good decision is, right? A good risk decision doesn't involve always getting the right outcome, because we can't control that. It involves somehow incorporating information in terms of the way we think and the way we feel, so that we can feel like we've at least incorporated that information and made a decision that is at least consistent with the information that's available.
I thank you for adopting my definition of risk communication. But I've written papers about the history of risk communication, and one of the things I'm actually trying to do right now is do research by asking all the people who say they practice or study it to define it, because you get that many different definitions.
Yeah.
And you've hit the critical heart challenge in those definitions, which is what's the goal, right? So I think pretty common in the goal of risk communication is to influence a choice. And that bumps into an ethical problem. It comes up in risk communication questions all the time. The history of risk communication, by the way, pardon my back, sorry. The history of risk communication started as a discipline, started in the late 70s from some of the people who I quoted were studying the psychology of why people get risk wrong. They were asked to study that by the nuclear and chemical industries, Paul Slovic and others. Why are people stupid afraid over what the people in the industry thought were small risks? And what can we do about it? So now that we know psychologically why they feel that way, how can we talk to them to make them calm down? And that sounds really stupid. That is still commonly what most people who say they practice risk communication hire themselves out to do.
Yep.
That is the common understanding of risk communication. How can we say this to calm them down? So that's obviously got some ethical problems in it right there. But it's one of the forms of we want them to think about things our way at the end. I've written my definition to talk about respect people's perceptions, right? As opposed to just make the information available to them, which is vital, absolutely. And it also includes at the end to encourage them to make healthy choices. I couldn't make your choice for you. I had a brain tumor that I was removed in 1992 when I got all stupid at the doctor's office and had to call him back later. What choice I was going to make? Your choice, none of my business. My job, though, as an ethical I feel, communicator, is to hand you the final decision making as well equipped as you can be. So the role of risk communication to me, health communication is a version thereof, is to equip people to make the best decision for themselves that they can. But pardon the lengthy answer. Here's one problem. If I'm a policymaker in charge of public health, I can't be that pussyfooted about it, because they're going to not vaccinate their kids and other people are going to get sick. Now I have to decide how to manage risk beyond just talking to people about it ethically, to encourage choices, to mandate behaviors. And in effect, that partly answers your question too, because if you want to decide for yourself to drive drunk or smoke or use your cell phone when you drive, sorry, society doesn't work that way. And just communicating to you about those risks isn't going to change your behavior. So this is an answer about how far can risk communication take us in encouraging the healthy choices we want.
Well, and I think it was you, Brian, who had a slide about sort of standardizing how we show or illustrate risk. And there was a question from the audience about, well, shouldn't that risk or judgment be left up to the patient? And I was wondering, well, we could standardize how we give the information, or we could individualize it so that maybe we're influencing somebody. There might be some ethical dilemma there, but what should we be doing?
Well, you talk about the ethics here. I experience this on a personal basis all the time. If you read my bio, one of the things you'll notice is that I have 2 academic appointments. My primary appointment's in public health, a field that is about population-level outcomes and policy. And I have a secondary appointment in internal medicine, a field that is about individual patient experiences and outcomes. Which means that when we talk about framing, when we talk about communication, when we talk about some of these, I can give you a choice to get vaccinated. Well, that's an individual choice. I like individual choice at the individual level. I don't like it when we end up with lots of people in the population not being vaccinated. So you can't escape the ethical responsibility to go back to that purpose. What am I doing today, right now? Is this a communication designed to increase vaccination rates? Well, I'm going to do that differently than I'm going to do a communication when I'm talking to an individual patient making a treatment choice in which they're going to have to live, that individual person is going to have to live with those outcomes, and there isn't that spillover to the population effect in that particular context. So what's the right way? There's no one right way.
Depends on the goal, what hat you're wearing,
absolutely.
Who you're dealing with, what the issue is. How personally fraught it is. I mean, I communicate with a lot of science journalists and communicators, particularly about climate change, environmental sort of stuff. There's a whole question there about how do we communicate with people and what do we want them to do? Do we want them to care more? And how do we get them to care more? All of the above. But I think, for me, the inherent idea in communicating to someone about health choices, risk is a loaded word even in and of itself. Implicitly, you want to be engaged in that process to have some kind of effect on the outcome. I mean, right? Otherwise, you're not having a conversation. So the challenge is how to do it in what context and within your own personal and social ethics and so on.
So let's switch gears just a little bit. There are some clinicians in the audience a lot who have read research articles and whatnot, and one of the questions that had come through was why not use, and this is for you, Brian, the number needed to treat, or number needed to, and I just let you know, if your handwriting is really good, your questions get read. The risk is like opposite, but
this reduces the number of clinicians whose questions are going to be answered.
But why not use that number in framing clinical decision making? And what does it work? Does it not work?
Okay,
what
so
makes sense?
number needed to treat or number needed to harm. I'll put on my lecturer hat for a moment. What is this, for those of you not familiar with it? It is basically the inverse of the absolute probability or the absolute incremental probability. So if you have a 10% chance of helping somebody, you need to treat 10 people in order to help one. That's the framework of the number needed to treat. Now, I have two thoughts on number needed to treat as a communication mechanism. One is, let's think about that, what it is in our English language lexicon, right? It's fundamentally a population level statistic. We're saying, how many people, how many patients do I need to see and do this intervention with before I will yield one who actually benefits from it? So from a policy-making standpoint, it's at least framing it at that population level. But if you look at it from the numeracy standpoint, remember when I talked about those changing denominators? Let's point out here, number needed to treat, smaller is better. That's not the way we usually think about numbers. You have to be pretty highly numerate to recognize that if I want a highly effective treatment, I want that number to be as small as possible. So for using number needed to treat in patient communications, the research evidence is actually pretty clear. It's very confusing to most patients because the less numerate people flip it around and they look at, oh, 100? That must be good because it's a big number. No, it's not good.
And this is in communicating in journals and stuff to other clinicians, is the question asked in that context?
Yes.
Well,
or I assume.
Okay. One of the things that I think it won't surprise you too much to point out is that clinicians are people too. And subject to the same foibles of innumeracy to some degree too. Not just two. I mean, there are all sorts of experiments about how well-educated medical people screw numbers up just as much as less educated non-medical people. How it's framed, the context, is it put in terms of loss or gain, there's a whole bunch of things. So I would be wary about relying too heavily on the hope that they can be rational in the first case, which is implicit in the question.
Right.
I think, Brian, you did a study actually that looked at how physicians make decisions, whether they're thinking of themselves or thinking of their patient, and I think that speaks to it a little bit, right?
Well, so that study wasn't so much about the format of the information as looking at the question of how we interpret. Remember I talked about risk to values? Right? Inherent in any medical decision is saying, okay, how much do I value this potential outcome? And let's see, one of the scenarios involved in that paper was imagine basically a flu epidemic in which, think 1918, major fraction of the population is going to die from this flu. And let's say we develop a vaccine, but it's a live vaccine, right? It's a live vaccine that will, in fact, harm a smaller but non-trivial percentage of the population. Do you want to be vaccinated? Now, at the population level, the public health person in me says, well, yeah, we want to get people vaccinated because I'll lose 10% of the population if I don't vaccinate, and I'll lose 1 if I do. Do you comfortable with having them stick a needle in you, knowing that that needle might cause you to die? It gets a lot harder. And
to reinforce that fact, from the psychological literature of what makes a risk scarier to us than less so, if it can happen to me. So a couple very quick examples. And by the way, this is why 1 in a million is too high to some people. You can understand that it's a smaller risk than 1 in 10. It's still too high because I could be the one. My job in evolution is not to worry about the denominator or those other people. That's for you policy people. My butt's above the line, right? Let me give you a couple very quick examples of that. In 2001, after the terrorist attacks, we started calling America the homeland. Isn't that weird? It's like Germany during World War II and stuff. We never used to call it the homeland. Take out the H-O. That's what it meant. Oh, Jesus, they're not just attacking Americans somewhere else. My butt's on the line. Changes everything. 50% of America, roughly, slightly less, had just voted for George Bush. A year and a half later, 80% of America was willing to support invading Iraq. M-E is a very powerful 2 letters when it comes to risk. And that's the above the denominator, and that's what is going to determine how the risk feels. Let me give you a very quick example of this. You all have candy on your table, the little bowl of candy? Okay. Headline, USA Today. Candy manufacturer withdrawing 1 million pieces of candy after disgruntled fired employee says he may have poisoned 1 piece of candy to get back at the company. Big risk or small risk, Amy? Second paragraph. That candy was delivered to the Farmington Marriott for distribution at the Donaghue Foundation's Beyond Eureka conference. I'm going to guess it just changed and you're thinking a little differently about what's in that bowl. It's a 1 in a million risk, right? She gets the number, 1 in a million. That's pretty dumb. You're a bright woman. Yeah, if it can happen to me, 1 in a million is too high. So the problem with numeracy is 2 problems. One is the challenge of helping people understand the data as a tool for making informed decision making. And the other one is, even when they understand it, it's still going to be a matter of, can it happen to me? And feeling about those numbers once we understand them.
You know, one of the questions from the audience was whether there's gender differences, ethnic differences, income status differences with how people perceive risk. I don't know if that's so.
So you may actually know this literature better than I do, but the stuff that I have seen is not as clear as you might think. There is a little bit of literature that suggests what is termed a white male effect. That white males perceive a variety of environmental threats as less risky than either women or ethnic minorities do.
Of either gender.
Of either gender.
By the name, it was named the white male effect by the white males who did the study.
Absolutely. Now, I don't know how much I believe that is a stable trait versus a reflection of the power dynamics, the income. It's hard to sort out the many potential influences on that, because if white males, to talk about control, if white males in our society believe that they have more control, that will play into their risk perceptions. Maybe they do have more control. That's a whole other question. One of the things that I do know is that it's hard to think about people as being stably risk-seeking or risk-averse. Our risk perceptions are very contextual. So the same person can go out and ride a motorcycle at 100 miles an hour and then come back and be unwilling to invest in speculative stocks. Or vice versa. All right. It's not like I'm a person who's always risk-averse or always risk-seeking. It does change from one context to another.
White male effect research, a couple papers, very quickly, Brian's covered most of it, asked people in various demographic groups, gender, race, and so forth, rank 10 risks. One was like tobacco smoking, and the last one was classic music, something that was probably going to come in last. And all the demographic groups ranked them the same. And then they also asked them on this one particular paper, how afraid of it are you, essentially? And the white males between age 18 and 59 were about 10% less afraid of the same stuff as white women or people of color of either gender. And the conjecture, and there are a couple other papers like that, and there's some muddiness around it, so it's not a really strong effect. And the conjecture is, yeah, people who think they're in control are less afraid. Right. And white men are or feel they are more in control. Sorry.
Interesting. Okay.
Except
Great.
for if you're the deputy mayor.
Right. Thank you. So let's talk obesity, going into the sort of public policy
Do we have
realm.
to?
Yes. So we were having a conversation, I believe it was last night, about calorie counts and menus. And I was also thinking about the soda tax and the push for, getting taxes and sugar-sweetened beverages and whatnot. How can public policy makers do a better job of addressing this obesity epidemic in terms of their communicating with the population about just what the risk is?
Oh my goodness.
I looked at you, but both of you can answer.
Yeah, so let me
Let him
give it a
go.
quick stab. So this is a very good example of what my thinking in terms of approach is. Without having a specific answer immediately, why does the problem exist? And some of it might be genetic, some of it might be, food deserts, and poor people can only afford junk food, which is higher in calories because it's cheaper. There's a whole bunch of dynamics, right? It's not just that Starbucks isn't listing how many calories are in the pound cake. Few were solved. But part of it is the perception, like I was talking about me with the sorbet last night, right? And sedentary lifestyles and all that sort of stuff. So from my little corner of things, I think that solution needs to be more holistic and include why people are making choices behaviorally and understand the psychology that it is choice. And I have optimism bias that it won't happen to me, I won't have the heart attack, or I have control and I can diet tomorrow, or there's a whole bunch of psychological literature that helps explain every bit as much as the genes might, or the food deserts might, what the causes are. Put them on the table as potential causes and look for solutions. That's changing the price of junk food. That's a whole bunch of things that can address that side of it need to be part of it. One complication, though, very quickly. A lot of people have said that obesity might turn out to be like tobacco was, right? So after a long time, it got stigmatized, and now it's really down. Too simple. My fatness doesn't do any direct harm to you. My smoking does. It's got a whole bunch of different affective, feeling nature things to it. It'll be way harder to stigmatize obesity than turning the corner on those people who smoke. Now they all stand in front of the hospital and you feel all sorry for them, and they used to be all cool. That corner's not going to be as easily turned.
Right.
So, again, too long-winded an answer, but there's a whole affective, psychological side that needs to be studied and understood and built into the policy thinking about what choices we should frame for society.
So, it's interesting. As you were talking about this, I kept coming back to a simple question. Does anybody not know on an individual level that if they want to lose weight, they should eat less and exercise more? I mean, really, have we not communicated that to some person living under a rock somewhere? Right? This isn't about somehow telling people, oh my gosh, I'm eating too much. Really?
Right, so how do we influence the choice? Right, exactly.
So where is the information most useful?
Right.
Good question.
Right. So this isn't about eat less, but maybe it is about which of the things that I'm doing are the things that I don't think of as having lots of calories that actually do. Right? There's a campaign that's been running, I think in New York, focusing on the message is very specific to helping people understand just how much sugar is in soda. There's an ad. So I teach a course on designing memorable messages to my MPH students. And we watched one of the videos together, and it's got this guy sitting at a bar. He comes in, and while he's waiting for his food to come, he starts taking out those little sugar packets, tearing off one and swallowing it, and tearing off another one and swallowing it, and tearing off another. And he keeps going at it, and people are looking at him. It's like, what the heck is wrong with you? And then it cuts, it says, look, you know how much sugar is in one 20-ounce soda? 16 of those packets.
Who just gasped? I was about to ask, that was my next question.
You wouldn't drink 16 sugar packets sitting at the bar, but you'd have a Coke. Now that's a communication that could change behavior, because it's correcting the misconception that the sugar in the soda just isn't that much. Do I think telling somebody, are you eating 2,500 calories or 3,000 calories instead of 2,000 calories is going to be where we're going to get action? No. But maybe at that mental model level of what of the things that I do or what of the things that I eat is the thing that could make a difference, we can change those kinds of behavior.
And here's another, just completely off the top of my head. Remember how if I didn't mention this, I should have. If you choose a risk, it's less scary than if it's imposed on you. Okay? So if I'm driving using my cell phone, happily taking that risk, and I look over and there's somebody driving using theirs next to me, that pisses me off. Pardon my French, but right, that's being imposed on me. It feels different. It feels different. That's why we all say pass laws. We're not saying take away my phone. Think about it, right? We're saying take away that's what government does.
Crazy guy's
Protect
phone.
me from the things that people are doing to me. So maybe you embed in the message that language, that psychological language. So yeah, you wouldn't choose, so you put the word choose, to eat these sugar packets, but guess what? You may not be choosing them, but you're eating them. Somebody else is making the choice for you. Now, what I've done is I've done his memorable message with the language of effectively ringing the alarm bell. Oh, I really don't like that. Those bastards are doing it to me.
Yep.
Sort of like the plastic bottle thing with BPA.
Yeah.
Now
Yeah, there are a lot of examples of this. So I guess what I'm suggesting and what I try when I advise people about risk communication is, in addition to making the information clear, that's got to happen, you frame it in the language that's relevant to how you want, this is the ethical question, people to feel and act. And that increases the emotional resonance of the clarity of information.
If I could run a slight tangent from this, but I think it's really relevant if we talk about public health risk communication. I've been thinking a lot recently about vaccination. And I think it's worth reflecting upon how different the world is today when we think about vaccination decisions than the world was when vaccines were first developed. Right? When polio vaccine was first developed, everybody knew people who had polio. You could make it, you talk about visualizing the outcome, you could visualize the outcome. You could have the emotional reaction that you're talking about of knowing what that outcome would be. And so when we were first introduced to the polio vaccine, which I will remind you was a live vaccine known to cause cases of polio, we were fine.
We were all got in line for it.
We
Raise
all
your
got,
hand.
absolutely.
You
We
bet.
were totally fine because it was our choice, and that was worse than this. Now, who here, okay, I better not say this, my age, has actually seen someone with polio? You are not my age.
That makes you wiser.
But notice how hard it is to ask a young parent to give their child a vaccine, even if it's one in which we are told it's a 1 in a million. For heck, it could be a 1 in a billion. How do I ask a parent to do that in a context in which I can't visualize that? That's a really, really hard problem. And it's a problem because we've built because of our own success.
It's a wonderful issue. And remember I talked about risk versus benefit? There's no benefit from the vaccines anymore to most people. They don't see the diseases. Measles, mumps, rubella, whooping cough, stuff that's still around, right? They're mostly gone. The vaccines worked. The risk is bigger than the benefit to those parents. It is. That's not stupid. That's not irrational. There's a tiny, tiny risk, but there's no damn measles, right? Except for there is. Except for there is. And it's in your neighborhood. And it's in your kid's school. If you go on YouTube right now, I wrote about this recently with the LA Times op-ed about vaccines. If you go on YouTube, you're starting to see a proliferation of videos of infants too young to be vaccinated from pertussis coughing to death from whooping cough. Talk about A, visual, and B, real.
Yep.
So where are those pediatricians who have long conversations with their patients? Just look at this. I'll give you the numbers. And A, visual, B, memorable, C, there is a benefit to these vaccines. It's not just a risk. That emotional language being invoked to respect the feelings that are relevant to their choice, to encourage a choice in a certain direction.
Right.
But that choice is actually going to benefit them and the population.
Well, you want to encourage them to think that there's more benefit than risk in the choice.
Right.
It's ultimately up to them. Hello,
Right.
America, and all of that sort of stuff. But society ultimately has the right to say there's a cost to us, so we have to encourage the behavior with regulations or disincentives, absolutely. But what you're trying to do with risk communication is where we started. You're trying to present memorable messages with clear information in emotional language that respects the feelings of the recipients, that encourages the healthy choice. So there's an example.
And simply saying to them, I understand why you are afraid.
It's the first sentence of any good risk communication.
That's right.
Trust building respect for their emotions as opposed to, you're wrong, here are the facts. Which, no matter how benignly you put it, is how most risk communication is done.
Yep.
Any message that says you should vaccinate, you should test your house for radon, is saying, I've decided for you how you should feel about this risk. And implicitly, no matter how benign it sounds, is not, I get why man-made radiation from radon is not scary and nuclear radiation from 3 Mile Island is. Same thing happens in me. But you should understand that just because source is man-made or man-made across the street or natural, your lungs, where it does the damage, can't tell the difference. I mean, I totally respect the fear, but you should understand that biologically, the bit is the bit is the bit wherever it came from, and your lungs can't tell the difference. So respected the feeling, built trust, that increases the constructiveness of the relationship and the influence then of the information that you give them. Very well, important point.
There was a question from the audience, and it reads like this. Michael Moore points out that the right encourages fear to keep the populace under their control. Given everything that we've talked about this morning, how do you respond to that? Or what can we do about this?
Oh, I'm all over it. I just talked too much, so I'm going to be second this time.
And it's not just the right. I mean, I think, speaking ethically, like, a lot of us might use some tactic to get people to make decisions that we think are in their best interest. So.
Well, let me answer this in the broader question then. When you come to learn about risk communication and come to understand this, the power of the emotional cues that we can give people, you are driving the equivalent of a huge semi-truck down the highway at 100 miles an hour. You better know how to control it, and you better respect the fact that you have a weapon at your hands. Now, we can use that for good, we can use it for bad, but it is powerful stuff. And so we all bear the ethical responsibility of deciding how and when we use it. And the fact of the matter is, I can't control how the right or the left or the drug company or anybody else is going to control it, but I can equip people to recognize what is being done and to give them balanced messages to try and counterbalance that. And I have to hope, and it is a hope because I can't know this, I have to hope that when all is said and done, yes, we will have those emotional reactions. But I'm in driver training class. That's my job. My job is to train you to be good drivers and to train the rest of the health communications world to be good drivers, because it's a big bus, it's a big truck.
One of the pioneers of the field of risk communication, along with Paul Slovic, doing the early studies on the psychology of why risks feel more or less scary, is a man named Baruch Fishoff. And he said in a book called Risk Communication, A Mental Modeling Approach, brilliantly, I love this quote, one should no more release an untested risk communication than an untested drug. It has that potential effect. We've talked about that all morning.
Yep.
If you get the numbers right or wrong or don't frame them right, the whole subjective, irrational side is going to have a potentially harmful effect. So that's the responsibility part. The answer to the person's question is, we can't change it. And everybody does it.
But is there a counter to framing in the context of fear? Because framing is obviously very important in terms of communicating risk.
Let's go down the list of people who use fear. That was the question, right? So I was in the media for 25 years, and I used it to make sure that my story was the lead of the day. And I didn't care about the ratings and making money. I didn't want to sell the papers, but my bosses did. So they're using it to make money. Let's talk about the battery company that wants you to buy their batteries and shows you the mother frantic for her missing son and presses the button on an electronic device that she'd put on him, and the buzzer goes off and she finds the son. Phew, buy our batteries. Let's talk about George Bush and Dick Cheney lying to us that Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein were close together. Let's set aside the weapons of mass destruction. There was some evidence that he might have them. What made us afraid of them was the bad guys who had attacked us were in league with Saddam. They might be able to bring those weapons here. A total lie. Let's talk about Michael Moore. Let's talk about Al Gore on one side and people on the other side with climate change saying fear for the economy, fear for the planet. Here's the deal. We all have things we want to accomplish in life. We're going to use the tools that innately feel like we can accomplish them. When we argue stuff all the time, we're going to use what inherently feels like it's going to be persuasive on people. And if I think I can persuade you by making you feel threatened, to buy my product, to vote this way, whatever, you're talking about deep inherent human nature. We here, wonderful, we're responsible, need to be responsible about it, and you are, and I try to be in driver training, absolutely. But this thing that this person is lamenting, part of the package. Beware of it, part of the package.
So how can we think of stress as a useful, creative tool? How does one evaluate it, since without some degree of stress, one might not enrich their lives to do other things, professionally or even personally?
I draw a distinction between stress, which at the biological level is that chronic activation, versus the more specific, in the psychological term, is motivation, right? We all need motivation and goals and wanting to do things. That doesn't have to be stress. I mean, your point about the zebras, I think, is right on, right? The zebra needs to be motivated to run like heck when the predator is there. And either it will work or not. And either they'll live or not. But when the predator's gone, the predator's gone. And to sort of say, I don't look at us as saying we want to have stress all the time. No, I don't want stress all the time. I'm way too stressed as it is. Believe me, my wife will tell you that. What we want is clear signals of when, what we want is, to use your analogy, a really good predator detection system. To know when we need to run and to know when we can relax. And that's the hard part.
Very quickly, this conversation is a perfect example of what I'm trying to press you about. The word stress is loaded.
Yeah.
It's subjective. What does stress mean to you? This morning, would everything go right? You know? Maybe stress is, can I make the foul shot? Yeah, we need that to achieve things. It's a subjective interpretation of what the word means. Yeah, we need it. But sometimes we don't want it. It demonstrates how all our perceptions are very subjective. It's a good example of that.
David, you had written in your book about, when we're looking at risk, catastrophic versus chronic. If something is catastrophic, acute, right there, we tend to fear it more than something that is chronic. Can I take it back to what I deal with in the city of New Haven?
Yeah.
Violence is a huge issue, community violence. And while it gets the headlines, X number of homicides in this city over this period of time, and there's a lot of momentum around doing something, especially in that moment when somebody is killed. We have gatherings of individuals on sidewalks or the places where the person was shot, having prayer vigils and whatnot. There's an immediate response. But then when you're trying to get folks to understand that not only is violence bad, but there is something that we each can do about it, it gets very difficult. And I don't know if that's because it's not always in our face every day, although some people will see it as every day. But it's also, there's some chronicity to it. It's like, oh, this just happens. This is just the way life is. How can a public policy person be responsive or make individuals see it not just as something chronic, But each and every time it happens, it is catastrophic, and therefore it requires our energy. It requires our movement in some way, shape, or form.
Well, there are a couple things very quickly out of the psychological literature. A risk that we've grown familiar with, car crashes, crime in the city. We generally get a little less afraid of, because most of us are still walking around the next day. So we've kind of checked it off. A risk that's new, West Nile virus. Remember when that first came? We were all freaked out.
H1N1?
New is just plain scarier. Catastrophic means two things. It's not just immediate, but it's a lot. A mass murder is worse than a murder. So more people will be murdered in America today than, if there's some mass murder that killed 7 people, more people than that will be murdered out there. It's a bunch of the tribe getting knocked off all at once, our tribe, any tribe. And the more so if it's people like you, you're more threatened. So that's part of catastrophic too. There's a third factor psychologically, and I'm going through these because I think you can use all of them as tools as a policymaker. And this factor is known as the availability heuristic. Fancy name, like academics like to talk. But basically what it means is the brain knows that the more readily a memory comes to mind, the more attention it better pay to it, because it probably mattered a hell of a lot when you burned it in the first place. That's why it comes to mind so fast. This is particularly true of scary things. We really want to be able to bring that up really fast. In fact, scary things are remembered in the amygdala, the network of synapses that say where you were on the morning of 911 are there. The network of synapses that say what you had for breakfast the day before, they're all over the place. You want to be able to bring it up really fast, right in the alarm system, the amygdala. So the availability heuristic has 2 relevancies to you. One is the latent fear of crime in the city, let's say, right? There's also the me factor, right? Does it happen in my neighborhood or not my neighborhood, right? Latent availability is we've had crime before. That's an easier bell to ring for you as a policymaker. May not be any on the street at the moment, but it's an easier bell to ring when you want to do policy things and program things and get at the underlying stressors that cause a lot of this stuff. There's also current availability. It's in the news. It's on our radar screen. I went home today and heard about what happened in my neighborhood. We have, it turns out, a finite, limited capacity to pay attention to what could kill us. The radar screen of the blips of uh-oh only fits so many blips. The bad news is when you have one of those high-profile deals, you're running around and screaming about it, that's when to have the policies to deal with the chronic risk more available, because those bells will alarm people who don't even think it could happen to me because it's chronic and built in, and it will ring a latent bell because they're susceptible to it because it's currently on their radar screen. Make it sound a little bit more like me. Sometimes you'll see risk information presented this way. This is, I think, a poor effort, but wow, that's as many people as would die in a 747 if it went down, That many people die of heart disease every day. That's as many as would be killed in one plane crash. That's an effort to do the catastrophic thing. I'm rambling a little bit, but we have a finite ability to fear, what to pay attention to, and the availability heuristic can be tapped for the ongoing policy that would get at the problems by the fact that people have been sensitized to this alarm. It'll go off faster.
So let me tap a couple things. One is, sort of what do you do in this when you've have somebody who's, if you have the misfortune to live in an environment in which violence is so common that you are inured to it, familiarized with it, it's very difficult to visualize the impact that it has on your day-to-day life because you don't have the contrast, the experience that somebody who does not experience violence in every day has, the feelings that they feel when they are confronted with an episode of violence are driven by the contrast, right? I don't experience this, and now it's different. Right. When you experience it every day, you don't have that strong reaction because the contrast isn't there. So part of I think the process is going back to that visualization idea. Right? How do you help someone who, I'll put this in a medical context, to really see the value in reducing their obesity? Right. Can you help them to imagine, and I'll go back to my comment about what are our health assets? Can you help them to imagine the endurance they would get, the strength they would have, the balance, the power that they would feel? Those are the things that those are the benefits that they might get back. And they can't see that because they don't have that lived experience. Now, the other thing I wanted to say when you talk about this issue of the contrast between those sort of very powerful trigger events and the chronic experience. I have, so I'll now date myself. When I was really focusing on watching lots of TV in graduate school and things like that was when The West Wing was on. Anybody remember The West Wing?
So you are young. Holy shit.
Yeah.
We're jealous.
So after September 11th happened, Aaron Sorkin wrote an episode that aired almost immediately afterwards. And there's a moment in that episode I'd like to remind us of. It's a moment when a group of high school students are trapped in the White House because the White House goes on lockdown, and they're having some conversations with some of the White House staffers. And this girl starts talking about the fear she feels. She's like, what does it mean? What does it mean to live in a society where terrorism is part of my life? What does it mean to think about the possibility of going down to my local pizza parlor? What is a society in which I could walk down to my local pizza parlor and it could explode? And Rob Lowe's character says very simply, Israel. Israel. Because Israel is a society where that is part of everyday life. And the Israelis somehow have to live with that consequence. And I'm not saying one is right or wrong, but I think the point of that story is to highlight that the fear reaction that student is feeling comes from the contrast of she can't imagine what life would be like to have this happen all the time. And the vice versa is true. If you do live in an environment in which that possibility is something that you have to deal with every day, to find the motivation to change it has to come, at least in part, from visualizing what life would be like without it.
No, thank you. We have actually run out of time, but I do, for the benefit of the audience, want to just ask this one last question. Keep it to a sentence or two if you can.
Yeah, right.
What is the takeaway message that you have for the healthcare professionals who are in the audience today about what we have discussed? What should they go back with and today maybe be able to implement?
You want to go
Two
first?
sentences.
Yeah, you're trying to influence people to make healthy choices. You can do that better if you respect the fact that perfect rationality is not achievable, and to communicate your information with respect to their feelings. You can understand a lot of the specific feelings of why it's scary or not by learning about that, but respect that you can't achieve perfect rationality, and encouraging a healthier choice means establishing a relationship of trust by respecting the subjective nature of the choice they're facing and presenting everything in that context.
That's a long run-on sentence.
Lots of semicolons.
Comma, and
my takeaway message, I'll pretty much say the things that I said in my slides. How you talk about the numbers matters more than what those numbers are. And ultimately, we don't remember the numbers. I don't walk around with some number in my head saying, this is my risk of developing cancer. What I walk around with is either the feeling of risk or the feeling of safety. And that ultimately is both what our target is as health communicators and what drives so much of our decision making as people.
Excellent. Well, I would like to thank both of you for participating in this panel discussion. But on behalf of the Donaghue Foundation, I want to thank each and every one of you for coming and participating in the discussion and dialogue with David and Brian. And I also want to thank the Donaghue Foundation for hosting this because, at least in my humble opinion, it is a rare and effective moment where you can actually bring together individuals from different sectors who are actually interested in health and health care. So the fact that they provide this forum every year to make sure that that happens is commendable, and I think we should give them a hand.